Does 1,000 years feel like a long time ago to you? Does it feel like it's a time that's so far away that it has no real effect on your common life today? It's hard for us to spend our time thinking about a time which basically feels like it's irrelevant. 1,000 years ago, for example, it was the year 1024. 1024. That is a long time. But there were people like Pope John. The caliphs were at some of their highest moments. Christianity and Islam were having some of their biggest battles. It's not that far away if you really consider it. But let's not talk about how far away or not far away this time is. Let's compare it to another time, and it's 1,000 years. This is the Step Pyramid. It's not one of the most fascinating pyramids in terms of being a actual pyramid, but it's one of the oldest and one of the most fascinating structures, period. And no one can take that away from it. It dates from 2600 AD. And this is the 1,000 years that we need to talk about because 1,000 years before this, something very interesting happened. Now, first, let's talk about the fact that Djoser is responsible for this pyramid being built, and this pyramid is a pretty fascinating sight indeed. Then, let's talk about the person who was hired by Djoser, Imhotep. And as we can tell, they are both true Africans, and their influence in Nubia is noted. At this very same time, Mesopotamia was kind of minding their own business, very far away from Egypt. They did have some influences all the way to Egypt, but it was minimal at best. While Nubia was basically an always knocking neighbor. Now, 1,000 years ago, what happened? Well, 1,000 years ago was 3,600 BC. This is the earliest time of writing in ancient Egypt. They basically invent writing at this time. This is crazy because when people say ancient Egypt, they think of it as one big chunk. Writing got invented, pyramids got invented, the clothes got invented, everything got invented at the exact same time, but this is not how it happened. The way it happened was in stages, and a lot of these stages can be charted down to true African steps. For example, the pyramids seem to be mastabas, which are completely something sideways compared to other African kingdoms, and stacking them up into a pyramid seems to be a very unique thing to the Egyptians. I've heard some people say that Nubians invented the pyramids first, and I've seen no proof of that because we can clearly see with the step pyramid that there is a trial and error stage of the pyramids. After this, you have the bent pyramid and you have all these other pyramids which are badly built because they were still experimenting. Some very small ones were successful, but those were not good enough for the king. And of course, we see them eventually perfect it. But let's go back to the 3,600-year date that I was talking about. 3,600 years old, 1,000 years. If your 1,000 years felt irrelevant to you, that 1024 AD feels like a long time ago. Remember, this was still the times of the Vikings. Imagine how that must have felt to people back then who didn't have that detailed of a history as we have. But did these people know that they were working on something big? Did they know that they were sitting on gold? Did they know that one day their civilization would be mentioned and fought over for thousands of years by people who can't decide whether or not they want to be ancient Egyptians? We might not have everything we need to answer this question, but we have some things that could help us, including pottery, writing, and some of the most pre-dynastic artifacts we've ever seen. Today, we're very familiar with the very serious and straightforward art of Egypt, since we have retrospect and we see its full history mapped out all the way till the Ptolemies and going back all the way till that step pyramid that I showed you. But you can see that some of the earliest depictions of humans and animals in ancient Egypt were a little confused. Not about the way they looked, but what style they were going to go for. You can see that this very cheerful guy who is standing here, pendant wise, almost feels foreign to Egyptian realities. He comes across as some other African or some part of the Middle East. It's not only about the way that they depicted men, as you can see, the way they depict women is also a little confused, utilizing this sort of jaw shape to accentuate the female figure, the female form. The hair itself, I cannot tell whether it's dreads or if it's not taken care of, but it's showing this trial and error that the Egyptians would have went through way early in their history. And by the way, some of these are collected in Nubia and some of them are collected in Egypt. So we know that this Naqada period, this 3,500, well, 4,000 to 3,000 period, shows us that there is a mix, there is a fusion, and a sort of like arrow that is deciding where to land and what exactly they feel they look like. Take a look at this barely visible man. He's sitting there religiously. His arms do not depict that of a normal person. Could this person be an early sign of religion? Or is it just another man who's badly created? Well created for the time. The ancient Egyptians, remember, believe in immortality and that the better captured you are in your form, it makes you come back looking exactly like you used to look. These people were so far behind in their artistic styles that the ancient Egyptians would have considered them basically unable to preserve the soul enough to resurrect it. Something that's more consistent and less speculative in the works of the ancient Egyptians are these black top pottery, and you can see that they were made in all kinds of parts of Africa. But the reason why they're not as confused is because they've been tried and tested for thousands of years before the Egyptians not got their hands on them, but were using them in this period, which would lead to a greater period in Egypt. Now, this African kingdom known as Egypt, which some people try their best to separate from Africa, has another feature to it that makes it very African, which is the utilization of female kings. We know that even before Egypt became Egypt, there were multiple female kings. We don't know if they were called pharaohs, but female kings who took over the kingdom and ruled like they would in some other parts. Now, the consistency of this many feminine rulers is consistent with Africa, and they had deities as well that sort of accompanied them, like Neith over here, who is named after a war goddess. This animal that also resembles the history of ancient Egypt, the very old history of ancient Egypt, you can see there that there's a compromise being made between geometric patterns and form of an animal. This is again consistent with other African kingdoms where they're given not love for geometric patterns always stayed above figures and forms of actual things. But Egypt did at some point decide to go with the animals rather than the geometric forms, using the geometric forms more as decoration on the outside, still with deep meaning, but having the animals be the ones right in the middle. And why wouldn't they? They were animists. At this time, we can see that their religion was something cross between ancestral worship and animism and would remain that way even within ancient Egyptian mythology. Their so called gods do not resemble what you want them to resemble. They are not the same as the male gods or the male and female gods that you would see in Greece and Rome. Instead, they seem to be personifications of natural manifestations. For example, if we take the crocodile, for example, we can see that they use the crocodile as a god in order to tame the crocodile. We see them use the birds, we see them use the bees, whatever you want to use, they use. And we see this all over Africa where the personifying of animals happens. Now, in Egypt, they gave them way more detail than any other civilization in Africa. And of course, Egypt is probably where you should go in Africa if you want to piece the story of why Africans believe the things they believe and how deep did their requirements or their love for their civilization go to the point where they would venerate this deep of a level. The animals they have available to them are the ones in Africa, the consistent ones in Africa. But something that's always confused me about this civilization is how they chose which animals they're going to use, like a lion, a crocodile, a hippo, a snake, and all these. These are some of the scariest animals, and yet they're using them to bring blessed moments into their lives. They do not use the giants inside their mythology, like the giraffe or the elephant. Why is this? It's almost like they predicted that the elephant would and the giraffe would be completely eradicated from Egypt at some point. But I actually can't tell you why, because I mean, a lot of these things that I'm showing you pre dynastic times, they're made from elephant bone. So we know there were a lot of elephants. A lot of these things are made from ivory, from elephant bone, elephant tusks. So why are they out here literally depicting elephants everywhere, but not showing them in, especially in the future, as a mythological creature like you would see with Ganesha in India? I mean, elephants are thought to be wiser than anything else in so many other kingdoms. But don't get me wrong, there is the early dynastic elephant king, so called elephant king. And some of the early dynastic things that happen also, since we're talking about their religion, have something to do with Nubia. So in Nubia, there are mass graves. And these mass graves had to do with human sacrifice, where the king would die and his subjects would go with him, be killed with him. They were not pierced so severely, so clearly they died without struggle. But we find this in early dynasties. So the Nubians had an effect on the Afroasiatics, known as the Egyptians. But when they did, what did that leave behind linguistically? This is why you have to separate this 1,000 years from Joser's time, because the language couldn't have been exactly the same. Not that it wasn't, it just a lot of things like names and stuff, we start to see huge shifts and things start to be more consistent in terms of words like Hotep or Horus being used more often. Whereas before, like I said, the other ones would be the Elephant King, the Scorpion King, the Hippo, all this other stuff. And just name after name after name that had to do more with title, and these are just kings. Think about what the average person was called. So, is there a gap, a moment where, if you look at the Afro-Asiatic languages from back in the day, they would be somewhat very different than what they became when they finally reached Egypt? And what about Israel? Israel has been occupied for thousands of years. What of that? What do we do with that information? Were the people in Israel in 5000 BCE Afro-Asiatics? We do know that the ancient Egyptians had reached Israel, not 5000 BC, but they reached it pretty early and had influence in both Tel Aviv, well, what is now known as Tel Aviv, and all the way down to Sudan, Upper Egypt.